Babysitters of Reddit. What seemingly normal parents had dark secrets? I used to babysit for my next-door neighbor who had an 8-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. I was 13 when I started babysitting for them, and I knew off the bat the kids were an interesting duo, to say the least. And I have too many stories to tell from when I was watching them. This year we all went to school together, so when we got off the bus, we'd walk to their apartment and I'd watch them, made sure we got homework done, and make them the snack of the day. One day, we had a half day at school, and I think the mom forgot, because when we walked into the apartment, I heard one of the doors shut. At the time, we thought it was an intruder, so I grabbed the 5-year-old's baseball bat, told them to stay in the room, and I'd do some investigating. I opened the bathroom door, and there was the mom, half naked, with a guy that wasn't her husband. She gave me all the money in her wallet and her business card. She was a photographer, and told me never speak of it again. I caught her cheating and made out with $400 and a $650 photo shoot package. Took pictures for all the upcoming holidays so I could keep giving gifts to my family. I babysat them for about 3 months before they moved away. I nannied for this very rich family with 3 kids from the West Coast who would come to South Florida for summer vacation every year. The mother was in her 30s, clearly had her kids when she was young, and was very stereotypically hot. Blonde, thin, big boobs, perfect teeth. Her husband was a little older, salt and pepper, super handsome, very George Clooney-esque. Their kids were all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, cute as fuck. They absolutely adored their parents. Dad would help the kids and mom settle in at the house and then fly back to Cali for work. I babysat 3 to 5 times a week. 6:30 p.m. - 2 a.m. Your mom would get all dolled up, leave her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and come home very late, clearly drunk, and sometimes brought men home with her that she introduced as her friends. She would often overpay me, which I never complained about, but I worried for the kids. I used to nanny for a family. At the interview they seemed totally normal. Even the first day wasn't too terrible. I quickly realized that both parents were abusive. Mom had severe anger issues, and was medicated for some condition related to it. Dad was a borderline sexual predator who constantly talked about how gross-looking his wife was, and how if she didn't stop being a bitch, he'd divorce her. Their kids were just as bad. One of them was also medicated for behavioral issues. I found out later that the reason they were hiring a nanny opposed to daycare was because their kids had been kicked out of the daycares in the area. Noped the fuck out of that situation within a few months. I babysit 3 to 5 times a week. You'd be surprised at how many sex toys I see. A lot of them are just out in the open, like they forgot to hide them. I overnighted once and the guest bed had bondage straps. Parents totally forgot about that. That's not too surprising, but some of their kinks are. Probably the darkest was this 5-year-old girl I babysit. She was the victim of sexual assault for a couple years by an aunt and uncle. No charges pressed or anything. Mom and Dad just cut all contact with that side of the family. I live in a small town, so I see the aunt pretty often. It's sickening. They understandably have a ton of cameras set up in their house now and aren't gone for more than a couple hours. The child has a very weird bedtime routine, which is how I found out. I was babysitting once and the kids were wrestling in the living room. All of a sudden the smell of dank filled the room. I hear the kids stop and say, "What is that?" Quote, one of them had knocked over a big tin can on a shelf and the parents' weed stash spilled everywhere. I sent the kids away and cleaned it all up for them and put it back. I was babysitting for a local family who owned car dealerships. I answered the phone, hello, as one does, and it was the father who didn't know his wife had hired a babysitter so she could go to an appointment. He started in with the stupidest sexy voice until he realized it wasn't wife. He hung up. Later he was caught cheating. I was babysitting for my neighbors, and they were super nice people. 2 kids. Very Pottery Barn people. They would always come home late, with no cash to pay me, but they'd come by my house literally the next day with the cash. So I never minded, but I was always a little confused as to how they spent all their cash at dinner and a movie and somehow didn't plan to pay the sitter, and how they managed to stay out till 3 a.m. just doing dinner and a movie. And they were pretty wealthy, so it wasn't like a waiting till payday thing. Once before they left, when they were in the other room saying goodbye to the kids, I went to move the wife's purse and saw a really big roll of singles. I brushed it off, but then another time their daughter had an allergic reaction and I texted them a SOS. When I got a call back, I picked up and heard club music. It was a couple sittings after that, when I left through the back door and saw the husband in the garage, shaking glitter off their clothes, that I realized they were probably going to a strip club. When I went to college, they switched to using my sister as a sitter, and I sat down with her and explained where they went and not to ask or act suspicious. They were good parents, and it's not like a problem. It was just super not the vibe they gave off, and I kinda found it hilarious. When I was 13 to 14-ish, I used to babysit 2 kids while their parents went to Amway functions. One night, for whatever reason, I looked behind the couch and saw a bunch of magazines. I collected them, thinking they'd been dropped behind there by accident by the kids I babysat. It was a huge stash of Penthouse and Playboy magazines, and I had to quickly re-hide them before the kids saw them. I was curious, naturally, but I told the mom when she drove me home. I don't recall if she said anything or not, but I stopped babysitting her kids shortly after that because I moved away. Not so much as dark but really sad. I babysat for a typical upper-middle-class family. Dad worked, mom was stay-at-home. The mother was always a little overprotective, like checking on their daughter the second they got home, but I didn't think much of it. One night they came home and we talked a little. She mentioned how much she loved children and her daughter, so I asked her if they ever thought about having another. She completely broke down and explained that she had multiple miscarriages before and after her daughter, so they stopped trying. I felt really awful and really sad because it seems like she wanted another baby. I never personally babysat, but I was watching a video on the internet and the seemingly normal parents came home and had sex with the babysitter. Work in an elementary school. A lot of horrifying, unexpected stuff tends to come up. I handle any behavioral calls, so tend to have a lot of contact with kids who are having trouble self-regulating in school. Sometimes these kids genuinely have a hard time, but often they can't regulate because they're in hyperdrive with what's going on at home. I had a mom tell me, in detail, the sex life between her and her ex. Another parent was arrested for drug trafficking and went to jail for 3 years a week after he'd attended parent-teacher conferences. Another parent got into a fight in the lobby and 911 had to be called. I worked at a daycare center. To be clear, these parents did not seem very normal. Mom had fake inflated Kardashian-sized boobs and butt and was generally very conceited, like almost a stereotype of a person with a body that augmented. She stood out among the other parents who picked up their kids from the daycare after working 12-hour shifts scrubbing floors and doing other blue-collar labor. Large immigrant community. Dad was more down-to-earth, so it seemed. Younger brother, age 7, told me he was anxious one day. He tended to be a worrywart, so I wasn't surprised, but I asked him why. He says that his dad yells at his mom a lot because she gets drunk, goes out and parties with her friends, and then he has to go and pick her up, which leads to a lot of arguing. I told him that that's really sad and that we would say a prayer for them. It was a Christian day. A week or so later he excitedly told me that the prayer worked, and his parents weren't arguing anymore. While Mac does say that all things are possible through God, so jot that down. I was only tentatively optimistic about YB's revelation. Older brother, 8, was a completely different personality. A bully to the kids and adults. Never had a positive thing to say. The things he seemed to like were his younger brother, Fortnite and Roblox. Like you do. Most of the school year we had butted heads trying to get him to do homework. But towards the end of the year his behavior changed. He would say he was too stupid to do homework and would try to hold his breath to try and commit suicide, in his own words. This seems like a huge red flag, and he eventually broke down and said that his dad was abusive towards him and that his mom says she doesn't like being around him as sure while he was prone to lying. He was crying, something he never did, and his behavior was like nothing me and my coworkers had never seen. That was my first time calling CPS, and when the next school year started those kids didn't come back. I nannied for a wealthy couple. She was a surgeon, he was an architect, and the husband had a study in the house that the wife joked about never being allowed in. Now, I'm a nosy fucker, and I was curious about why you wouldn't let someone in a study, especially since it looked like a fairly normal room. Big desk, walls covered in bookshelves, books of architecture everywhere. So one day I just roamed around in there. I didn't really find anything, and I was kinda disappointed. But then I grabbed a book off one of the shelves. The thing had money pressed between its pages, about $500. If I had to guess. Picked up another book, found the same thing. I think I checked like 10 different books, and every single one had money hidden in it. Still not sure if the dude was just paranoid about banks or if he was intentionally hiding money from his wife. I was babysitting at my neighbor's house. They were a young couple, early 30s, with 2 kids aged 5 and 8. I was 16 at the time, and the first questions they asked me was if I had a boyfriend and if I was a virgin, because they didn't want me seeing boys while babysitting. I think part of the reason why they asked this is because they were pretty wild themselves and probably did crazy stuff when they were younger and babysitting. When they found out I smoked, they always left some cigarettes for me. They always told me that they'd be home around 12 or 1. But most of the times I would fall asleep and they would stumble home completely drunk around 3 in the night. They'd give me way too much money as an excuse, which I obviously didn't mind. After a while the dad started messaging me online. First just asking innocent questions, but after a while they became more sexual in nature. I told him I didn't feel comfortable with that, so he stopped. They broke up a while later, and the mom started throwing wild parties at their home. I randomly walked by with a friend of mine once and she invited us in and gave us a beer. Me and my friend felt pretty cool. Here we were at a grown-up party, having beers, until the mom came up to us to offer us some cocaine. We were shocked and declined and left the party quickly after that. I told my parents a couple of years later about all this, after the mom and kids moved, and they were outraged. Apparently they always acted like they were very respectable. I babysat for the local policeman when I was a teenager. He always came home very drunk and in a weird mood, and one time brought out a homemade Ouija board and persuaded me to take part with his buddies. Always paid me really well. Edit to clarify.